Hey guys, this is for 6B. This is talking about community ecology and succession of environments, talking about how the biomes that we've been studying come about, right? Coming about on a geological level, and talking about how different species kind of interact with each other. All right. Okay, so something kind of interesting kind of talk about in terms of ecology is this idea of a keystone species and stuff we've been talking about. This is the black-footed ferret. It's the only native weasel that we have in the United States. And the really interesting thing about it is when we started farming out in like these grasslands and prairies, we had a lot of these prairie dogs, and they would eat up all of our stuff. They would wreak havoc on the agriculture we had. Not good, it can be argued that it's not good that we were there in the first place, but as our population is growing, we need to be able to feed our larger population. So this is kind of where the borders of our two communities come together, right? Where we interfere with the environment, and the environment has to be managed in a way that benefits everyone. So these ferrets, they ended up going close to being extinct because we poisoned all these prairie dogs, which was their food source. And once they were gone, the prairie dogs weren't necessarily gone, right? So we use methods such as captive breeding. We found a few of these left, and today they're now on the threatened list. And some things that we can consider in terms of managing the ecosystem without having to use poisons is maybe just taking care of the predators, right? Taking care of these ferrets so that they can take care of the prairie dogs for us, right? Just making sure that there is a protection against them or a protection for them. We don't use poisons, so that way we don't take out both of these, right? The target species we're trying to take out are the prairie dogs, not the lethals, right? So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Alrighty. Community ecology. Alright, so the goal of what we're doing here is you want to identify species interactions that cause negative effects on one or both species. So this is talking about your mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Discuss species interaction that cause neutral or positive effects on both species, and explain the role of keystone species. Alright, let's go. Move along. Alright. In community ecology, it's the study of interactions between species. We have some symbiotic relationships, and the definition of that, relationship between two species that live in close association with each other. So think about species that do that. Think about species that can do that together, right? So somebody the other day drew like the shark and the pilot fish, and things like that. I think like a zebra, like one of the finches that live on the bulls, things like that, and pick all the ear bites out of it. Negative species interactions include competition, predation, parasitism, and herbivory, and we'll get into what each one of those mean. So competition is the struggle of individuals to obtain shared limiting resources. Remember that limiting resource is the thing that if you have less, your population necessarily has to decrease. And then we come along to this idea of the competitive exclusion principle. Two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. And so speciation and natural selection here end up favoring a range of taste, right? So if you only eat pizza and somebody else eats pizza and tacos, you're going to be gone, right? I mean, they can eat tacos if there's no pizza around, right? So that's the idea of competitive exclusion principle. If both y'all like the same limiting resource, your population is going to have to decrease. When two species have the same realized niche, one species will perform better and drive the other to extinction. So you can kind of think of that as like weeds, right? Weeds do that. Maybe taller trees. All right, here's some more competition. So this is a goss. He had two species of Paramecium in test tubes here. When they grew together, the P. aurelia continued to grow. P. caudatum declined to extinction. These demonstrated that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. And here you see the carrying capacity of both as it turns into an S curve, right? So this is logistic growth, right? And you can see here, they do all right when resources are abundant, right? They're abundant for a small population. As we go up, we have a sharp decline, right? All right, so here's that overlap curve we were talking about earlier. So resource partitioning, when two species divide a resource based on differences in their behavior or morphology. Okay, so this is important right here. This is the exam question based on behavior or morphology. So what do we mean by that? So maybe if you like to go eat during the day, and this guy likes to eat at night, right? That's behavior. Morphology would just be like the shape of your body. Maybe you have differences in the way that you get food. And so maybe if you have some animal that's only this tall, there's a tree here, there's fruit right here, and you have an animal that's this tall, and even though they eat the exact same fruits, this guy can get the stuff up here, right? Also, camouflage, right? Camouflage also helps. All right. The evolution of resource partitioning. When two species overlap in their limited resource, selection favors those who the use of resource overlaps the least at other species. Okay, so that's A, right? So right here, anybody that's in here, not very good. These guys, you see this, so now it's cut out, right? You cut that out, and you end up with this type of curve. See how the curve, in both of these, the area under the curve is a little bit less now, right? All right, predation, an interaction in which one animal typically kills and consumes another animal. Parasitoid, a specialized type of predator that lays eggs inside an organism referred to as its host. An example of that would be wasps. Wasps like to do that. And of course, prey develop defenses against predation. Parasitism, an interaction in which one organism lives in or on another organism. A pathogen, so some sort of a disease, right, is also considered a parasite. A single parasite rarely causes the death of the host. Can you think about why parasites might have co-evolved to do this? Can you think about why? Why do they co-evolve to not kill their host? Do you think it's advantageous if they do kill their host? All right, herbivory, an interaction which an animal consumes a producer. Herbivores become abundant. They can have dramatic effects on producers. So you just think about this. If we increase the herbivores, what's going to happen to the primary producers? To decline, right? All right, so we have to make sure that we have our predators in numbers that can control these guys, right? So think about that in terms of your trophic pyramids. So if these guys go down, what's going to happen to this? Up, and then these go down. Many species of producers have evolved defenses against herbivores, like poisons and things like that. It's pretty hard to eat things like grass here. Right? Other species interactions can cause neutral or positive effects on one species. So mutualism increases the chances of survival for both, right? Commensalism, a relationship between species in which one species benefits and the other is neither harm nor help. Okay, so think about some relationships that kind of do this. You may be given examples of this and then have to decide whether it's commensalism, mutualism, parasitism, etc. So let's look here. Here's a nice little graph that describes this. It's competition. It's bad for both, right? It's bad for all. Predation, it's good for one, right? It's good for the one that eats. Parasitism is good for the one that's feeding off the other one. Herbivory is good for the person eating the plant. It's not good for the plant. Imagine if you have like a broccoli head. It's a really bad broccoli head. And then you get eaten by like a tortoise or something. It's not good for you. You lost half your head, right? Mutualism, good for both. And commensalism, good for one. It's nothing to the other. Keystone species have large effects on communities. And remember, we said these are not necessarily, they are not producers, right? Producers, of course, are important. If you got rid of all the producers, that would be bad, right? That's bad. But we're talking about things that sometimes can be higher up in the trophic pyramid, not necessarily a top tertiary or quaternary predator, but something in the middle that everything kind of energy flows through, right? So we're looking at a trophic, we're looking at a food web that maybe, this guy is a generalist, right? To eat a bunch of different things, right? But then you also have things that are a little bit higher up that also go to him. A little bit higher up, so go to him, right? Maybe this guy gets eaten by somebody else, but it doesn't matter because maybe this guy doesn't involve in any of these lower things, right? So this would be a keystone because look, everything right here kind of connects to this somehow, right? And he's even the food source for the larger predators, right? Big old guy right here, right? So this is important. That's the keystone. So think about this. It plays a far more important role than his abundance, or what we're going to say here is biomass, right? Might suggest, right? So he has low biomass, but very high importance. An ecosystem engineer is a keystone species that creates or maintains a habitat for other species. I want you to think of beavers. Not sure about any other ones, but beavers are important because they make the dams, right? And those dams end up being houses for fish, pond-like pond-like species. They end up being duck and bird nests, woodpeckers, things like that. Um, so think that like a stream, it's flowing right, really fast. But if you put a dam in there, if you dam it, right, you end up getting this nice, instead of like these vectored really fast, you end up with like a nice pond, right? And something that's a little bit slower, so you get like these slow floating algae and things like that. So it's good. They're an engineer because they build things. All right. Now let's talk about community succession real quickly. We need to be able to explain the process of primary succession, secondary succession, aquatic succession. What we're looking at here is we are eventually, all of these are moving towards complex, high complexity, but terrestrial, so land, terrestrial ecosystems, right? Even though it's kind of weird, right? I would star this, even the aquatic succession ends up leading to terrestrial ecosystem. Let's see how that affects the richness of a community. All right, primary succession. Every community experiences ecological succession. And what that is predictable replacement of one group of species by another over time. And we're usually talking about plant life when we're mostly concerned with plant life when we're talking about terrestrial succession. We're talking about aqua. It can be plant life, but parts of the succession, secondary, mid-level succession for aquatic ecosystem is going to have animal life. Things that attach to rocks, right? Okay, so let's look at this. This is a little hard to see on yours. What you need to see is that in primary succession, you start with rocks. You have no soil whatsoever, so you can't grow things like grasses and trees, right? Then things like lichens, mosses, and algae will attach to the rocks, right? And when they die, their chemicals will break down the rock, and all of a sudden you've got soil, right? You got a little bit of soil. So that's going to let things that disperse very easily and grow rapidly, like wildflowers and grasses, grow here. You've got perennial wildflowers and grasses next. You see how it goes from short, so the height of these plants starts really small here, and at the end you see really high level. But what happens here, this is going to be all mid-level succession, right? Or mid-level succession. To get to secondary succession, you have to have a major event wipe all this stuff out, either a hurricane or like a tornado or something like that, right? Some sort of tornado or maybe like a fire. The fire is going to wipe all this out. It's going to wipe out everything here, but what are you going to be left with? You can't, burn the soil away. So the soil is going to be left there, right? As long as you don't end up with something like a tidal wave that sweeps away all the soil, you're going to be fine. And that soil left over is going to give birth to pioneering species such as cherry, aspen, young pine, because their seeds disperse in the wind very easily, or the cherry seeds are carried by birds in their stomachs, right? Seeds, they will disperse, right? Finally, you end up with like these idea of like a quote-unquote climax species, like the beech and maple, broadleaf deciduous forest trees. But we stay away from the word climax forest or climax section of succession, because any event can reset to an earlier time, basically at any point. If I end up with like a fire here, right back to here, right, mid-level, or maybe even right after the primary succession, right? All right, so secondary succession starts with soil. You have to have soil. Okay, areas have been disturbed. You need to be able to list natural disasters that occur. Okay. Wildflowers are important. Grasses are important because what they do is they are providing nutrients for later levels of succession. Right? When they catch on fire, their nutrients stay in the soil. Right? And they're also, of course, since they have roots and stuff like that, they are keeping in water. They're going to absorb, resist the flow of water right there. So they're going to retain water. H2O, H20, right? So and that water is going to be good, and the nutrients are going to be good for these more needy plants right here, right? These needier, larger plants. Okay. Aquatic ecosystems, they take thousands of years. What happens here is some sort of thing is going to flip over some of these rocks sometimes, or the rocks are going to grow like some algae. The algae is going to die, and they're going to attract other things. That dead plant matter is eventually going to pile up, and look what you're going to get. You're going to end up with land, right? You started out with water and end with land. That's basically how succession and aquatic things happen. All right. So species richness is going to be influenced by latitude, time, habitat size, and distance from other communities, right? So the closer to other communities you are, you have some gene flow, right? So we're connecting to old chapters. Habitat size, right? So we're going to have bigger gene pool. Time, obviously, there's more time for natural selection. Latitude, right? If you have more heat, higher the heat is, higher heat energy, the higher the amount of life forms you can have that sustain, right? Remember the producers like the algae and things like that need a lot of sunlight, a lot of photosynthesis. Theory of island biogeography, theory that demonstrates the dual importance of habitat size and distance in determining species richness. We talked about that a little bit uh, with things that emigrate into smaller areas. And species richness increases as the size of the habitat increases. Researchers counted the number of bird species that inhabited reed islands in Lake Valence, Hungary. The island area increased, the number of bird species initially rose quickly and then began to slow. Okay. All right. So I hope you have learned how succession works. I hope you've kind of looked at the different relationships that animals have and try to make connections in your reading packet. Bye-bye.